When talking about Souls games, I usually ask not only myself, but a lot of people as well, what makes them great? Is it the dark, gritty setting that's filled with a lot of lore, the combat, whether it's a slower, more calculated pace of Dark Souls 1, the aggressive style of Bloodborne, the rhythmic nature of Sekiro, or the perfect blend of all those previous combat styles in one that's presented in Elden Ring? Or could it be the level design, or maybe the fact that the games have RPG elements? To be honest, a lot of people get drawn in usually by one or all of those things, but the one thing that I haven't mentioned that definitely carries the games a lot are the spectacular bosses. Let's be honest, apart from the combat, the bosses make up the core foundation of these games. Without them, the games would feel a bit empty. And that doesn't just go for the Souls games either. A Souls-like, which by the way are the games inspired by the actual Souls games, these games can have the most amazing combat ever. But if the bosses are terrible or mid at best, then my overall enjoyment for the game goes down a bit. It just feels like something is missing. Yet on the opposite end, if the game has mediocre but serviceable combat, but the bosses are beautifully designed in both appearance and mechanics, then I would feel way more satisfied. Take Dark Souls 2 for example. If you've seen any of my previous videos, then you know how I feel about this game's combat, bosses, and overall gameplay. The combat is slow as shit and it's also kinda clunky and a bit floaty at times, and the bosses in the game suffers from quantity over quality. However, there are a few exceptions. Fume Knight and Sir Alan. If you ask many Dark Souls 2 players who their favorite boss in the game is, the chances of them saying either Fume Knight or Sir Alan is pretty high. Some may even say Burnt Ivory King, but I'm gonna talk about him later. You see, despite how slow and kind of weird the combat is in Dark Souls 2, fighting these two bosses never felt infuriating, unless we're talking about the random shitty hitboxes and input reading. But apart from those, these two bosses are really great because one, their presentation is amazing. I mean, look at the design of both. One is an ancient looking knight scorched by flames wielding a giant F-off sword, and the other is just a samurai looking dude that can zoom across the arena in 0.2 seconds. And two, they both complement the game's combat style, as while they're not super fast, cause if they were it would definitely feel a bit unfair, they make up for that by hitting hard as hell. Now some other things like lore count towards your enjoyment, but that's what I wanted to talk about with them. But the main reason I'm making this video is that while many devs are starting to take boss design more seriously, some games still treat bosses as an afterthought. So today I wanted to go over the 4 main factors of what makes a good boss fight. These are the presentation, combat flow, challenge/balance, and story significance. Also major spoilers for these games. Let's start with presentation, at least visually. In my opinion, this is the second most crucial aspect of making a great boss. You need to make them look cool. Yes, cool. Now I'm not saying you have to make the boss look cool in a traditional way like making them look edgy or whatever, but you have to make them stand out or not boring looking. I watched Magic Cat's video the other day and he made a good point. Most people will find a boss more memorable if they look, well, visually interesting. He mentioned Lu Bu from Wukong and compared him to another boss from the same game, and I forgot what the other boss was even called, but that just goes to show how forgettable he was. I mean, I even played Wukong and the only boss I remembered from the game was again Lu Bu. Even though there might have been, better bosses mechanically, he still stand out mostly because of how well he was presented visually, and the fact that he's Lu Bu, I mean, come on, a lot of people outside the game knows of him. But that aside, you have to make their visual appearance striking. I mean, take a look at Midra for example. He's not the most complex boss in Elden Ring, he doesn't switch his moves mid combos, he's not super fast or anything, and he doesn't have a shit ton of combos either. But his design is what carries him. Sure, he's still a fun fight mechanically, a bit basic but fun, but the sheer aura and spectacle he presents is amazing. First of all, when you go into the fight, all you see is just an old feeble guy screaming and yelling, and when you beat the hell out of that said old man, he rips out the blade that was impaled through his body, gets up only for his head to be replaced by the frenzied flame orb. I mean, just look at this. The fiery orb for his head, the frenzied flame abilities, the torn flowing yellow robe which complements flame aesthetics, and his graceful yet unnerving movements. All of this makes him one of, if not the coolest looking boss in the entire game. And again, let me make this clear. I'm not saying that the boss has to look beautiful in a traditional way for it to be visually striking. Take Ludwig for example. He's up there as one of the best Soulsborne bosses ever, yet he looks like if someone took a kid's drawing of a horse monster and made it realistic looking. I mean, bro looks like what would happen if a mad scientist tried to create a real-life centaur. He looks disgusting and very unnerving, but in a good way, as his design is one of the most memorable aspects of him, especially in the second phase when he picks up the Moonlight Greatsword. Sure, it's just a pretty looking sword, but it's little things like that that adds on to the presence of the boss. Now obviously there are many more reasons why people love him. I mean, he's fun mechanically and he has some amazing lore behind him. But let's be honest, his visuals definitely play a big role. Burnt Ivory King is another great example of this, as he's arguably the most visually striking boss in Dark Souls 2 because of his arena. But the final example of this I wanted to bring up is Luxasia. Now in terms of mechanics, I'm not a super big fan of her second phase. Sure, it looks really cool and visually it's great, but fighting her feels a bit unfun during the phase due to her speed. However, I'm going to talk about that later on in the video. But if we're focusing just on pure visuals, she stands out as one of the best in the game. In her first phase, she wears a knight looking armor and wields a large powerful greatsword, and in the second phase it transitions to one of the coolest looking cutscenes in the game. I mean, just look at this.
Oh, Simon. Your sword, Luxasia, swears to protect this tower.
I got goosebumps after seeing this because, I mean, it just goes so hard. Plus I was hard too. I'm just playing. But overall, when making good bosses, you have to take their visual presentation into consideration. This doesn't only go for the design of the boss themselves, but also where you're fighting them, as a spectacular or unique looking arena can make the boss stand out even more. Again, Burnt Ivory King is a good example of this. Also, what I like is when their design tells a story or has lore behind it. But again, all in all, visuals play an important role for a boss. Now let's move on to another factor. Combat flow. By combat flow, what I mean is the boss should feel enjoyable and fit seamlessly with the game's combat mechanics, and it should challenge the player to use the skills they've learned while offering new twists to keep things fresh. One thing I truly hate is fighting a boss that feels out of place, like it doesn't truly belong in the game, whether they're too fast compared to the player or it doesn't have that flow that many other bosses in the game has. There are a lot of examples of bosses that don't flow well combat wise in their respective games, at least to me. The first biggest example is pre-nerf consort Radahn. I've talked about this guy a lot, and don't worry, I won't bitch about him too much because as of right now, after the patch, he's genuinely enjoyable. But pre-patch, man, he was awful. But before I talk about his pre-patch fight, let's talk about the combat of Elden Ring so we can get a better understanding of what I'm trying to say. Elden Ring takes the traditional Souls formula and adds its own uniqueness to it by incorporating tiers, which grants you additional buffs. Each weapons having ashes of war that can be swapped out with one another. You can also use spirit summons, which can be powerful in their own rights. You see, the combat of Elden Ring is what I would call medium paced. It's not fast like, I don't know, Bloodborne, but it's not slow as the earlier Souls games. It fits perfectly in the middle, slightly above Dark Souls 3. However, going back to pre-patch Radahn, he felt super overtuned. His attacks are usually followed up by blinding light beams. Some of his special attacks felt unforgivingly fast, especially when he starts levitating in the air, as if you don't run the millisecond he starts floating, then you'll get caught in the explosion. He did a lot of damage, he's super tanky. His cross slash attack would hit you no matter how well you dodged it, and worst of all, he had very little downtime. He felt like one of those purposely overtuned modded bosses that's just hard for the sake of being hard, and not to provide an actual fun experience. You see, pre-Radahn felt like he was made for a whole other game, as at times it felt really hard to keep up with him, and that's a complaint not only me but other players had as well. However, at least they fixed him in the patch where he has way more downtime and he's less blinding. Now the same thing can be said for Luxasia. While her first phase is amazing despite having some weird unnatural animations, her second phase in terms of combat felt a bit overtuned. While it may not be as bad as pre-nerf Radahn, she's way too fast, random and chaotic at times, and this wouldn't be an issue if the player had decent speed to keep up with her. But her character in Lies of P has a very slow dodge and doesn't move that quickly. And the parrying can be a bit stiff, which doesn't help either. But that's not the biggest issue, as her main issue is that she doesn't have any downtime. So she's just zooming around the arena constantly while barely giving you any time to attack her, and this can get pretty frustrating. Now some good examples of bosses that fits well within their respective games in terms of combat flow are Gale, Mesmer the Impaler, Nameless Puppet, Great Sage Broken Shell from Black Myth Wukong, and Ishin the Sword Saint. Obviously there are more, but those stood out to me the most. Gale is pretty much the peak of the traditional Souls boss formula, as it literally feels like a duel. He's fast while giving you plenty of chances to land hits, his attacks are dynamic, he doesn't have any random bullshit move that catches you off guard, he's super fair but provides a good challenge. Also, I like the fact that even though he's fast, you're still able to dodge most of his attacks easily. The same can be said for Mesmer the Impaler. Nameless Puppet forces the player to use the parrying mechanic effectively while also allowing them to dodge most of his hits with careful timing. The way Broken Shell complements the combat of his game is by allowing the players to keep up with him with their speed despite him being the faster one. At first he felt a bit overwhelming, but once you get his attack timing down, you'll realize that you can easily keep up with him. And Ishin requires the players to learn how to counter most of his attacks using everything they've learned while playing through the game. Things like basic deflection, lightning reversal, Mikiri counter, and the overhead stomp. After learning all these skills, just like Gale, fighting Ishin feels like a true duel, as it feels like it's two equals fighting against one another. So overall, making a good boss doesn't just mean they have to look cool, but they also have to complement the style of the game they're in. Again, if the player character is slow, the bosses shouldn't be blitzing around the arena making it hard to hit them unless the game provides a decent enough mechanic to counter this. The best bosses are the ones that forces the players to get good and use the mechanics the game taught them early on, whether offensively or defensively, while making the fight flow well. And speaking about getting good, let's talk about the next factor. Challenge. A great boss doesn't have to be difficult to be memorable. Take Divine Dragon for example. He's a simple boss, but the visuals of the fight are what makes it stand out. However, challenging bosses tend to leave a stronger impression. Look at Melania for instance. I remember watching Kai Cenat's Elden Ring marathon where he averaged around 100k viewers, which is insane by the way, but when he fought Melania, the viewership shot up to 200 to 300k, which is just like insane. It's crazy how a notoriously difficult boss can draw in hundreds of thousands of people just to watch someone try to beat them. But I still believe that difficulty doesn't automatically make a boss good. Even though Melania is a decent boss, her waterfall attack is pure bullshit. When designing a challenging boss fight, it's crucial to aim for difficulty that feels fair. Too often some devs, especially in Souls-like games, think that making a boss hard just for the sake of being hard is what players want. But no, players want something fun yet challenging. A good boss should push you to use the core mechanics of the game while adding a new twist. You can make the boss harder by giving them mix-up combos, more health, or a significant damage boost. Whatever you want, but it has to feel fair. By fair, I mean equivalent exchange. If a boss is fast, hits hard, and has a lot of health, the player should have a consistent way to counter that, like being able to read their attacks and dodging them consistently. Gale is a great example of this balance. If your game's core focus is one-on-one encounters, don't throw in two bosses in a cramped room and let them attack at the same time. It's not fun and it goes against the game's mechanics. You can still do a duel fight, but you have to balance each boss in a way where they don't overwhelm the players. In the end, balance is key. I'd rather fight a boss that's somewhat easy but fun than one that's overtuned and doesn't fit in its own game. The last core factor of what makes a good boss is the story significance. Now I've saved this for last because at the end of the day, when talking about video games, gameplay always comes first. But that doesn't mean you should shy away from telling a good story. This can be applied to making bosses as well. You see, usually when I encounter a boss, I have these questions in mind. Who are they? Why are they here? Why are they trying to fight us? Why does he have snakes going through his body? You know, stuff like that. Having a mechanically complex boss is great and all, and it's still more important than the story aspects, but at least give us some answers on the boss's significance to the story. You know, whether they were a powerful figure that was built up through the whole game, only for us to duel this legend at the end. They could be somewhat of a rival type character where we fight them multiple times throughout the story because they're in our way from achieving our goals and we're in theirs. This helps build up a connection with that said boss, so even if you fight them 3 times throughout the whole game, it doesn't feel copy pasted or lazy, but something that makes sense story wise. But if you're gonna do this, it's still best to keep each encounters fresh by adding something new. Now you can still add a cool boss without any major build up, but at least have their appearance make sense, by explaining it through dialogue or cutscenes outside the boss fight. This way you can subtly hint at the boss's existence and roll within the world without making them feel super random and out of nowhere. Now before I move on, I'm not saying every single boss has to have a crazy story behind them, as a lot of mini bosses from most games are just foot soldiers, but at least have them make sense in the world. In the end, what makes a boss fight great is how different elements come together to create an unforgettable, challenging, and enjoyable experience. It's not just about being hard or looking cool, it's about how the fight engages the player in multiple ways, testing their skills while keeping the things fair and fun. A great boss fight pushes the player but also feels rewarding, offering a sense of progress and mastery. It also pulls you deeper into the game world, often serving as a powerful or emotional climax in the story. Whether through clever design, memorable visuals, or deep story connections, the best boss fights stay with you long after the game ends. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you like content like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. Also, shout out to my paid Patreon members Jabroni Jones, Mac, and Daniel Scotland. Thank you guys for the support, and thanks to the rest of you for watching this video, and I hope you guys have a good one.